Control tower. We have an unauthorized etched on runway 4. It's the ghost pilot's old jet, impossible. The reply crackled. She's on the memorial wall. Whispers Arab tedicras the airbase as the silver fighter jet rolled onto the runway and darkness. People stared at each other mocking, believing someone was impersonating the fallen legend. But when the aircraft's identification goal flashed on screen, the entire base fell silent. Who was in that cockpit and why was a ghost flying Gagan? Captain Evelyn Monroe, 38 years old, was once the most outstanding female fighter pilot of the elite Phantom Wing unit, renowned for her exceptional skills in classified missions that never made it into official records. 7 years ago, during a covert operation deep in enemy territory, her aircraft vanished without a trace. No wreckage was found. No body was recovered. The military declared Captain Monroe killed in action and her name was etched onto the memorial wall alongside other fallen heroes. What nobody knew was that Evelyn had served a vet in absolute secrecy. A classified agency had extracted her from that mission, placing her under the highest level of witness protection after she had successfully dismantled an entire enemy intelligence network. For 7 long years, she had been operating in the shadows, carrying out missions that would never appear in any official documents, eliminating threats that ordinary citizens would never know existed. Tonight at the annual memorial ceremony held at Falcon Ridge Air Base, the entire military community had gathered to honor their fallen comrades. The ceremony was solemn, filled with a quiet respect reserved for those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Among the crowd stood Master Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, a weathered man in his 50s with oil-stained hands that told the story of decades spent maintaining aircraft. Frank had been Evelyn's chief maintenance officer, the man who had personally prepped her jet before every mission. He stood silently before the memorial wall, his callous fingers gently touching the engraved name, Evelyn Monroe. "You always flew too fast, Captain," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening wind, "always pushing that bird beyond its limits." The old sergeant's eyes were moist as he remembered the countless nights he had worked on her F-5 Tiger II, the silver fighter jet that had been her pride and joy. She had nicknamed it Silver Ghost because of how quietly it could slip through enemy radar. Now that same aircraft sat abandoned in a forgotten hangar, gathering dust like a monument to better days. Just as Frank was about to step back from the memorial, a deep rumble shattered the ceremonial silence. The sound of a jet engine roaring to life echoed across the base, cutting through the solemn atmosphere like a blade. Every head turned toward the source of the sound. From Hangar 7, the old maintenance building that had been sealed for years, a silver F-5 Tiger II began rolling on the main taxiway. The aircraft moved with purpose, its single engine spooling up to full power. The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Some people looked offended, others appeared genuinely angry. This was supposed to be a sacrament, a time to honor the dead, not some tasteless practical joke. "How will dare do this?" someone shouted from the crowd. "This is disrespectful." Security vehicles immediately began racing toward the runway. In the control tower, a young air traffic controller grabbed his radio, his voice sharp with authority. "Unidentified aircraft. Shut down your engine immediately. You are in violation of base security." But the silver jet continued its steady roll toward runway 4, completely ignoring all radio calls and ground signals. The pilot inside remained silent, focused only on the task ahead. Frank stood frozen, staring at the familiar aircraft. Even in the darkness, he could recognize every rivet, every panel of that particular F-5. It was impossible, but he knew that jet better than his own reflection. "Silver Ghost," Hugh whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. The ghost was no longer sleeping. The murmurs in the crowd quickly turned into angry whispers, trite accusations. "This is absolutely disgusting," a red colonel spat, his face red with indignation. "Whoever's in that cockpit is mocking everything we stand for." "Some sick joke," another voice added, "using a dead hero's aircraft for attention. Shameful." The security team was already in motion. their vehicles forming a barrier across the taxiway. The base commander, General Harrison, grabbed a megaphone and barked orders. Block that runway. I don't care who's flying that thing. They're not taking off on my watch. Inside the control tower, chaos was erupting. The young air traffic controller, Airman Peters, was frantically trying to establish a radio contact while his supervisor paced behind him like a caged animal. Unknown aircraft. You are ordered to touch it down immediately. Peters shouted into his headset. This is a restricted military installation. You are desecrating a memorial service. Nasto. But the silver F5 continued its steady roll, completely ignoring every command, every plea, every threat. The pilot inside remained as silent as death itself. Meanwhile, in the cockpit of the Silver Ghost, Captain Evelyn Monroe sat with the calm of someone who had faced far worse situations. Her hands were steady on the controls, her breathing controlled and measured. She could hear every word being transmitted over the radio frequencies, every curse, every command to stop. They don't understand yet, she thought to herself, but they will. Evelyn's men drifted back to the countless nights she had spent in the enemy territory, alone with no backup, no extraction plan, and no guarantee she would ever see home again. She had survived torture, betrayal, and missions that would have broken lesser pilots. Tonight was just another challenge to overcome. Her eyes remained fixed on their own way ahead. The memories of her supposed death were still vivid. The explosion that had provided perfect cover for her extraction, the staged wreckage that convinced everyone she was gone forever, 7 years of letting people she cared about believe she was dead, 7 years off watching from the shadows as they mourned her. But some secrets were worth pain they caused. The security vehicles had now formed a complete blockade across the runway entrance. Armed personnel were taking positions, their weapons trained on the approaching aircraft. The situation was escalating rapidly. General Harrison's voice boomed across the base through the public address system. Attention, unknown pilot. You have 10 seconds to shut down your craft before we are forced to take action. This is your final warning. Frank Rodriguez stood among the crowd, his weathered face pale with recognition and impossible hope, while everyone around him shouted in anger. He whispered a prayer he hadn't said in 7 years. Please let it be you, he murmured, tears streaming down his cheeks. Please let it really be you. In the control tower, Airman Peters was becoming increasingly frantic. His supervisor had called for backup, and the entire base was now on high alert. But something strange was happening to the radar system. Peter stared at his screen in confusion. Sir, I'm getting some kind of system anomaly, he called out to his supervisor. The identification transponder is it's showing something impossible. What do you mean impossible? The supervisor snapped, rushing over to look at the screen. Peters pointed with a shaking finger. The aircraft's call signals showing up as Phantom 06. But that's Captain Monroe's old designation. The supervisor grabbed the radar console, his knuckles white. Run the identification check again. The system must be malfunctioning. I've run it 3 times or sir. Same result every time. Suddenly the main computer screen flickered and a new line of data appeared. Phantom 06 Monroe status verified active. The control tower fell dead silent. Peter stared at the screen as if it had just told him the sun was rising at midnight. His supervisor's face went completely white. That's impossible, the supervisor whispered. She's been dead for 7 years. Her name is on the memorial wall downstairs. But the computer didn't lie. The identification system connected to the most secure military databases in the country was confirming what everyone knew couldn't be true. Peter slowly reached for his radio, his hand trembling. General Harrison, he said, his voice barely audible. Sir, you need to know something. The pilot identification has been confirmed. About time. Harrison's voice crackled back. Who is it? Peter swallowed hard. Sir, according to our systems, the pilot is Captain Evelyn Monroe. Call sign Phantom 06. Status shows as active duty. The radio went silent for a full 10 seconds. Then General Harrison's voice returned, but no, it was different. Quieter, shaken. Confirmed that identification immediately. Already confirmed 3 times. Sir, the system shows Captain Monroe is alive and active. On the runway, the security vehicles began slowly moving aside. General Harrison's voice came over Thebes wide communication system, but no, his tone had completely changed. All security personnel, stand down immediately. Clear the runway. Repeat, clear the runway and stand down. The crowd at the memorial ceremony stood in stunned silence, watching as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. They were witnessing a name on a gravestone come back to life, watching story and reality collide in a moment that defied everything they thought they knew. Frank Rodriguez fell to his knees, his hands pressed against his heart. What happens when someone you mourned for 7 years suddenly asks for permission to fly again? When a name carved in stone appears on a radar screen? When the dead refuse to stay buried? Type resurrection if you believe some legends never truly die. And ghosts never ask permission to return. The runway lights illuminated the silver ghost as it rolled to a complete stop at designated parking position. The entire base held its breath, watching as the canopy slowly opened with a mechanical roar that seemed to echo across the silent airfield. A figure in a flight suit emerged from the cockpit, moving with the practiced precision of a seasoned pilot. Even in the dim lighting, there was something unmistakably familiar about the way she carried herself. The confident stride, the straight shoulders, the way she moved her helmet with deliberate care. Captain Evelyn Monroe stepped onto the wing of her aircraft and looked out at hundreds of faces staring back at her. 7 years had changed her. There were new lines around her eyes, a few strands of silver in her dark hair, and scars that told stories no one would ever hear. But her presence was undeniable, commanding the same respect she had earned all those years ago. General Harrison was the first to approach. His face, a mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like relief. Behind him, a small team of senior officers followed, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion to barely contained emotion. Captain Monroe, Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. How is this possible? Evelyn stood at attention and saluted. Reporting for duty, sir. I apologize for the dramatis entrance, but some things require a certain level of theater. We buried you, Harrison said, shaking his head. We held a funeral. Your name is on the memorial wall. With respect, sir. You buried an empty coffin and a carefully constructed story. Behind the general, Frank Rodriguez pushed through the crowd of officers. When Evelyn saw him, her composure cracked for just a moment. The tough, unbreakable pilot suddenly looked like the young woman who had trusted this man with her life countless times. Frank, she said softly. The old master sergeant couldn't speak. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he looked at the pilot he had mourned for 7 years. Finally, he managed to find his voice. Your bird, he said, gesturing toward the F5. I kept her running every month. I'd start Harab, check the systems, change the fluid system just in case I came home. Evelyn finished. Thank you, Frank. I knew you would. General Harrison stepped forward again, his mind racing to understand the implications. Captain, I need answers. Real answers. Where have you been? Why did we think you were dead? And why are you here now? Evelyn looked around at the crowd that had gathered. Military personnel, civilian contractors, family members who had come for the memorial service. All of them waiting for an explanation that would make sense of the impossible. 7 years ago, during Operation Silent Thunder, my aircraft was shot down over enemy territory. She began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent base. What she didn't know is that the mission had a secondary objective. I had discovered a massive intelligence breach. Someone high up in our own command structure was feeding classified information to enemy forces, the crowd murmured. But Evelyn continued. The explosion that supposedly killed me was staged by a joint CIA and NSA task force. They needed the world to believe Captain Evelyn Monroe was dead so that Agent Evelyn Monroe could disappear completely. For 7 years, I've been operating under deep cover, dismantling the network of traitors and enemy agents that had infiltrated our military. General Harrison's face had gone pale. The intelligence leaks that stopped 7 years ago stopped because I eliminated the source, Evelyn confirmed. 13 enemy operatives, 4 compromised officials, and 1 very surprised general. What hot he was selling outdated information turned out to be selling real-time strategic plans. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone present understood they were hearing about operations that had saved countless lives, prevented attacks that would never make the news, and protected national security in ways they could never have imagined. So why reveal yourself now? Harrison asked. Why end the operation? Because it's over, Evelyn said simply. The network is destroyed. The threats have been neutralized. And because she paused, looking at the memorial wall visible in the distance. Because some of the people I care about most have been mourning a ghost for too long. Frank Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. All these years, I blamed myself, thought maybe if I'd caught something during the pre-flight checks, maybe if the maintenance had been better. Frank, you gave me the most reliable aircraft in the fleet. That F-5 saved my life more times than I can count, even when I had to fly other planes. I always knew yours were built to bring pilots home. Dr. Sarah Chen, the base psychologist, pushed through the crowd. She had been the one to counsel the families after Evelyn's supposed death, including Frank and several other crew members who had taken the loss hard. The survivor's guilt, she said, realization dawning in her voice. So many people blamed themselves for not being able to save you. That's the hardest part, Evelyn admitted. Knowing that good people were carrying guilt that belonged to me alone. But operational security required them complete commitment to the cover story. And no exceptions, no matter how much effort. General Harrison looked around at his personnel, many of whom were wiping away tears. Captain, what you've done, the sacrifices you've made, this goes beyond the call of duty. No, sir, Evelyn replied firmly. This is exactly how duty looks like. Sometimes it means flying into enemy fire. Sometimes it means disappearing completely, so that others can sleep safely. The mission always comes first. A young lieutenant in the crowd raised his hand tentatively. Captain, how do we know it's real anymore? How do we know holes might be gone but not really gone? Evelyn smiled. The first real smile she'd shown all evening. Lieutenant, in this business, you learn that the best operators are the ones you never hear about. The real heroes are the ones whose names never appear in the history books. We do what? We do so that you can focus on the mission in front of you, not the threats you can't see. She turned back to General Harrison. Sir, I have one request. I'd like my name to remain on the memorial wall, not as someone who died, but as someone who understood that sometimes the greatest service requires the greatest sacrifice, including the sacrifice of recognition itself. The general nodded slowly. Captain Monroe, welcome home. As the crowd began to disperse, Frank approached Evelyn one more time. What no, Captain? What happens next? Evelyn looked up at the stars, then back at the aircraft that had carried her home. Now, Frank, we get back to work because Thesky never stops needing guardians, and some ghosts are meant to keep flying. What had begun as a solemn memorial service transformed into the most extraordinary celebration in Falcon Ridge Air Base history. Word spread quickly, and soon off-duty personnel were returning to witness what many called a miracle. The base chapel became an impromptu gathering place. Chaplain Miller, who had delivered Evelyn's eulogy 7 years ago, stood before the assembled crowd. Tonight we learned that faith takes unexpected forms. He said, we mourned a hero we thought lost, but discovered our guardian angel was still protecting us from threats we never knew existed. Young pilots surrounded Evelyn, their eyes wide with admiration. Lieutenant Sarah Kim raised her hand nervously. Captain Monroe, how did you maintain hope during those 7 years? Evelyn looked at the eager faces around her. These were the next generation who would carry forward the traditions that had guided her career. Lieutenant, hope isn't something you maintain, she said. Hope is something you create through action. Every mission I completed, every threat I neutralized, that was hope material for everyone who would never know they were safer. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached with a small metal plaque. Captain, we want to change your memorial entry. He showed her the new plaque. Captain Evelyn Monroe, Phantom 06, Guardian in the Shadows, Service Beyond Recognition. Your name stays on the wall, Frank explained. Not as Someone we lost, but as someone who chose to serve in a way that required the ultimate sacrifice, anonymity. Future generations need to know that some heroes operate where medals can't follow. Dr. Chen, the base psychologist, understood the profound impact this revelation would have on everyone who had carried guilt over Evelyn's suppositith. Captain Monroe, would you speak with personnel who have struggled with survivor's guilt? Your wingman Johnson from that last mission, he's never forgiven himself. Of course, Evelyn replied. I'd like to establish a program here for personnel dealing with invisible wounds, guilt, loss, classified missions they can never discuss. General Harrison returned with official word from higher command. Captain Monroe, effective immediately. You're assigned as Senior Advisor for Tactical Operations and Personnel Resilience. You'll work with our next generation while consulting on sensitive operations. The crowd erupted in applause. For the first time in 7 years, Evelyn Monroe could serve openly, mentor young pilots, and help heal wounds that secrecy had created. As the evening wound down, Evelyn stood unseen again before the memorial wall. Her name would remain there, but now it carried a different meaning. It represented not death, but the kind of life that willingly disappears so others can live safely. Frank joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the base cafeteria. Just like old times, Captain, he said, handing her a cup. Better than old times, Frank, she replied, looking at names of fallen comrades. Because I know we can honor them properly, knowing that service takes many forms, and sometimes the greatest heroes are theons whose stories we're never allowed to tell. Young Lieutenant Kim approached them. Captain, will you teach us what real service looks like? Evelyn smiled, the weight of 7 years finally lifting. Lieutenant, real service isn't about recognition. It's about being willing to do what needs to be done, even when no one will ever know. She gestured toward the memorial wall. Every name here represents someone who understood that principle. Some died in combat, others disappeared into shadows, but all served something greater. Frank raised his coffee cup. To the Guardians in the Shadows. To the Guardians in the Shadows, Evelyn echoed. The memorial service had become a homecoming. The ghost had found her way back to the living. 3 months later, Captain Evelyn Monroe stood before a classroom of eager young pilots. The morning sun streamed through windows of new Tactical Operations Center, illuminating faces that looked at her with respect reserved for living legends. Today we're going to talk about something they don't teach in flight school, she began. We're going to talk about the difference between being a pilot and being a guardian. Lieutenant Kim raised her hand. Captain, what's the difference? Evelyn walked to the window, looking out at the runway where her silver ghost sat gleaming. Frank had spent weeks restoring it to perfect condition, treating each panel like a sacred artifact. A pilot FLI's missions, she said. A guardian protects something larger than any single mission. Sometimes that protection requires you to disappear from the world you're protecting. Sometimes it means letting people you love believe you're gone forever. She turned back to face the class. 7 years ago, I learned that true honor isn't found in recognition or medals. True honor is found in the willingness to serve without acknowledgement, to sacrifice without glory. The students listened intently. There are names on that memorial wall outside. Some belong to pilots who died in combat. Others belong to guardians who chose to disappear into shadows. What they all have in common is understanding that service isn't about what you get back. A young cadet spoke up. But Captain, how do we know when that kind of sacrifice is necessary? Evelyn smiled, remembering asking herself the same question during those 7 long years. You'll know because when the moment comes, you won't hesitate. You won't calculate the cost to yourself. You'll only see what needs to be done. After class, she walked outside to find Frank performing his daily inspection of the silver ghost. How are the kids doing, Captain? They're learning, she said. Some understand that being a guardian means accepting that history might never record your real contributions. Others are still focused on becoming heroes, Frank chuckled. The best guardians are the ones who start out wanting to be heroes and end up realizing that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is remain invisible. As evening approached, Evelyn stood once more before the memorial wall. Her name was still there, but now it carried a different inscription. Guardian in Teshadows, service beyond recognition. Other names surrounded hers. Pilots, intelligence officers, special operators, all guardians, all people who had understood that sometimes Thagrieta's service requires the greatest anonymity. She touched the cold stone gently. Some legends never stay buried, she whispered, and when they return, they bring new understanding of what it means to serve. The ghost pilot had come home, not to rest, but to teach others that sometimes the most important flights are the ones nobody ever hears about. Subscribe Iron Heart Stories if you believe real legends never stay buried. And when they return, the sky stands still.